The Oklahoma land rush ran over bodies, but whose land, whose erasure, and whose reparations? How did the Dawes rolls weaponize race in Indian Territory? The blood, quantum land theft, and the erasure of dark-skinned indigenous nations. The story of Indian Territory, what colonizers renamed Oklahoma, reveals one of the most sophisticated mechanisms of indigenous dispossession in American history. Through the Dawes Commission and its notorious rolls, the United States government didn't just steal land. It weaponized racial categories to fragment resistance, erase dark-skinned indigenous peoples, and create divisions that echo through sovereignty struggles today. This is the story of how documentation became a weapon, how Black and Indian were made mutually exclusive, and how nations like the Washitaw, Freedmen communities, and Muur peoples were systematically erased from their territories through the violence of colonial classification. The Unassigned Lands, manufacturing empty territory. In 1889, approximately 50,000 settlers lined up at the border of Indian Territory for the infamous Oklahoma land run. They were racing to claim 2 million acres. The U.S. government had declared unassigned and open for white homesteading. The scene captured in photographs and celebrated in American mythology showed white settlers stampeding across virgin land to claim their piece of the frontier. But this land was far from empty or unassigned. Happened in 1866, when the U.S. government forced the Creek and Seminole nations to cede these lands as punishment for some tribal members' Confederate alliances during the Civil War. The treaty specified these lands would be used to settle freed slaves and other tribes, was the broken promise. The government never settled freed people there. Instead, they held the land in limbo for over 2 decades, then declared it available for white settlement, was the erasure. By calling these lands unassigned, the government disappeared the Creek and Seminole peoples who had been forcibly relocated there during the Trail of Tears. It disappeared the freed people who had been promised homesteads. And it disappeared the indigenous nations, including dark-skinned Muur and Washitaw peoples who had territorial claims the government refused to recognize. The land run didn't happen in empty territory. It happened in territory that had been systematically cleared through documentation violence, broken treaties, and the strategic deployment of racial categories that rendered certain peoples invisible. The Dawes rolls, documenting people out of existence. Between 1898 and 1914, the Dawes Commission traveled through Indian Territory with a mission that would fundamentally reshape indigenous identity in North America. Their task: create rolls listing every member of the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, to dissolve communal landholding and assign individual allotments. But the Dawes rolls did far more than count people. They created categories that separated families, erased complex ancestries, and institutionalized racial hierarchies that tribes had not traditionally maintained. The categories imposed, by blood, those deemed authentically indigenous based on blood quantum calculations, intermarried whites, non-indigenous spouses with limited rights, freedmen, descendants of enslaved people, listed separately regardless of indigenous ancestry, minor freedmen, children of freedmen, often with indigenous parentage erased, doubtful, those whose claims were questioned, often dark-skinned applicants. Notice what this system accomplished. It made Black and Indian mutually exclusive categories even when individuals had ancestry from both African and indigenous peoples. A child with a Creek mother and African-descended father could be classified as freedmen only, erasing the matrilineal kinship system that would have granted full tribal membership through the mother's line. This wasn't documentation. This was reclassification. The Dawes Commission wasn't recording pre-existing identities, they were creating new ones that served colonial land theft. By separating people into rigid racial boxes, they, 1. reduced the number of recognized indigenous people, justifying land seizures. 2. Created internal tribal conflicts over membership that weakened collective resistance. 3. Established precedents for blood quantum that would haunt indigenous communities for generations. 4. Erased dark-skinned indigenous peoples by forcing them into freedmen or Black categories. The freedmen caught between nations and erasure. The freedmen were descendants of people enslaved by the 5 civilized tribes. But this simple designation obscures tremendous complexity. Many had indigenous ancestry through mothers or grandmothers. Many had lived as tribal members for generations before enslavement. Some, particularly among the Seminole, had never been enslaved in the chattel sense, but lived in tributary relationships. Many were indigenous people from other tribes who had been enslaved during intertribal conflict. After the Civil War, the 1,866 Reconstruction Treaties theoretically granted freedmen freedom from enslavement, full citizenship in their respective nations, and equal rights to land and annuities. But the Dawes rolls shattered these promises. How each tribe's freedmen were dispossessed. Cherokee freedmen listed on separate rolls from Cherokees by blood, granted citizenship but systematically discriminated against. In 2007, the Cherokee Nation voted to remove freedmen descendants from tribal citizenship, a move a federal judge overturned in 2017. Those struggles continue. Creek freedmen, granted citizenship and allotments, but often received inferior land. The separate roll system allowed the tribe to later challenge their citizenship status, creating generations of legal battles. Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen denied citizenship entirely. Instead of equal allotments like tribal citizens, they received only 40 acres each, and even these small plots were often the rockiest, least arable land available. Seminole freedmen received the most egalitarian treatment, with full citizenship and equal land rights. This reflected the Seminoles' more integrated relationship with Black Seminoles, but even here, federal pressure and blood quantum politics created later divisions. The pattern. Regardless of tribal citizenship status, freedmen faced smaller allotments than by blood members, inferior quality land, white guardians appointed to manage their property, who systematically defrauded them, legal restrictions preventing them from selling or developing land, exclusion from tribal decision-making, ongoing challenges to citizenship and land rights. The Washitaw Case. When dark-skinned indigenous sovereignty challenged the system. In 1999, the Washitaw Dedugdamoundia Nation took their sovereignty claims to federal court, asserting rights to millions of acres across Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Texas. The Washitaw identify as indigenous peoples of African descent Moorish nations who have occupied the Mississippi River Valley since time immemorial, long before European colonization. The courts dismissed their case. Legal scholars often cite Washitaw Nation v. Department of Interior as an example of frivolous indigenous claims. But this dismissal reveals more about colonial legal systems than it does about the validity of Washitaw sovereignty. The Washitaw argued, 1. Pre-Columbian presence. They are indigenous to the Americas, not descendants of enslaved Africans brought during the transatlantic trade. 2. Continuous occupation. They maintain communities, practices, and territorial claims throughout colonization. 3. Fraudulent land transfers. The Louisiana Purchase couldn't legally transfer lands they already occupied and never ceded. 4. Moorish heritage. They descend from ancient nations with African phenotypes who were indigenous to the hemisphere. Why the courts rejected them? The legal system's rejection rested on the same colonial logic that created the Dawes rolls, the black divided by Indian binary. Courts assumed African descent equals enslaved ancestry, making indigenous claims impossible. Documentation requirements. Demanded European colonial records to prove indigenous status, ignoring how those very systems erased dark-skinned peoples. Blood quantum and recognition politics required federal recognition under criteria designed to exclude exactly these types of complex ancestry nations. The authentic Indian myth enforced narrow, phenotypic, and cultural expectations that erased indigenous peoples who didn't match stereotypes. The Washitaw Case wasn't dismissed because their claims were false. It was dismissed because the legal system cannot recognize indigenous peoples whose existence challenges the fundamental categories, Black and Indian, as mutually exclusive, that justified land theft in the first plus Muur and Creole nations. The people's documentation disappeared throughout the Gulf Coast, Mississippi River Valley, and into what became Oklahoma. There existed indigenous nations that colonial systems worked systematically to erase. Moorish indigenous peoples. Communities identifying as indigenous peoples of African descent, often asserting pre-Columbian presence or descent from ancient transoceanic migrations. These nations maintained that African phenotypes among indigenous peoples predated the transatlantic slave trade. Creole nations, communities of mixed indigenous, African, and sometimes European ancestry, who formed distinct nations with their own territories, governance, and cultural practices. In Louisiana and the surrounding territories, these included Redbones, Melungeons, Brass Ankles, Turks, Guineas. Why colonial systems targeted them? These nations were particularly dangerous to colonial land claims because, 1. They challenged racial categories. Their existence proved Black and Indian weren't mutually exclusive, undermining the Dawes Rolls logic too. They held prime territory. Mississippi River Valley lands were agriculturally rich and strategically valuable. 3. They couldn't be removed. Unlike recognized tribes subject to Indian removal policies, these nations weren't on official tribal lists. They were just there. 4. They preserved African indigenous connections. Their presence suggested deeper hemispheric networks and migrations that challenged European-centric historical narratives. How they were erased. The mechanism was documentation violence, census categorization, classified as mulatto, colored, or free people of color, never as indigenous. Dawes Rolls exclusion, denied the right to even apply for tribal enrollment. Land title challenges. Their traditional territories weren't recognized as indigenous lands, so they had no federal protections. Segregation laws. Jim Crow systems forced them into Black legal categories, erasing indigenous identity. School and church records. Systematically documented them as Negro or colored, creating paper trails that denied indigenous ancestry. By the time of the Oklahoma land runs, these nations had been documented out of existence. Their lands became unassigned, not because they were empty, but because the peoples occupying them had been reclassified in ways that erased their territorial claims. Understanding land was stolen from Freedmen, Washitaw, Muur, and Creole nations requires seeing the system as a whole. Force indigenous peoples to cede lands through coerced treaties. Categorize dark-skinned indigenous peoples as Black, freedmen, or colored. Create separate roles that fragment communities by race, promise land to freed. People but never deliver. Dawes Commission creates rigid racial categories. Apply blood quantum to determine authentic indigenous identity. Place freedmen on separate roles regardless of indigenous ancestry. Classify Muur and Creole peoples as non-Indian. Create doubtful category for dark-skinned applicants. Reject applications from those who don't match phenotypic expectations. Give smaller allotments to freedmen. 40 versus 160 plus for by blood members. Assign inferior quality land, rocky, non-arable, far from water. Declare freedmen incompetent and appoint white guardians. Allow guardians to sell or lease allotted lands. Pocketing proceeds. Create complex legal restrictions preventing freedmen from selling or developing land. Ignore allotment claims from non-recognized Muur and Creole nations entirely. White guardians systematically. Defraud freedmen landholders. Grafters' use. Legal schemes to separate freedmen from allotments. Oil discoveries on freedmen land lead to murders and forced sales. Non-Indian certificate process strips lands from mixed-blood individuals. Tax. Foreclosures target freedmen unable to pay due to systemic poverty. Entire communities displaced. Lands consolidated into white ownership. Tribes remove freedmen descendants from citizenship roles. Courts uphold tribal sovereignty to exclude based on race. Muur and Creole descendants have no tribal affiliation to. Claim. Federal recognition requirements designed to exclude nations without colonial documentation. Historical narratives celebrate Oklahoma as open to settlement. erasing indigenous and freedmen presence, contemporary sovereignty struggles framed as new, rather than continuous resistance. The numbers tell the story. By 1920, of the millions of acres allotted through the Dawes process, freedmen had lost 90% plus of allotted lands through guardian fraud, legal restrictions, and forced sales. By blood, tribal members had lost 60-70% through similar schemes, though they had more legal protections. White settlers had gained millions of acres through land runs, allotment purchases, and fraudulent transfers. Muur and Creole nations had 0 acres recognized as indigenous territory, their lands fully absorbed into Oklahoma. The unassigned lands theoretically set aside for freed people in 1866 went entirely to white homesteaders through the 1,889 land run and subsequent openings. Not a single acre went to freedmen communities as promised. Why documentation violence matters. Connecting to today, the Dawes rolls weren't just a historical injustice. They created systems that continue to dispossess and divide. Blood quantum today. The categories created by Dawes rolls became the foundation for modern tribal enrollment. Cherokee Nation's 2007 vote to exclude freedmen descendants cited the separate rolls created by Dawes. The same logic that freedmen by blood aren't Cherokee by blood weaponizes colonial documentation against people whose ancestors were tribal citizens. Federal recognition. The Washitaw and other Muur nations face impossible barriers to federal recognition because they lack European colonial documentation, which was designed to erase them. They don't fit phenotypic expectations because those expectations are racist. Their oral histories aren't considered proof because only colonial records count. Their territorial claims challenge narratives of empty land, which justified white settlement. The Black Indian binary. Contemporary discussions of race and indigeneity still enforce the mutual exclusivity created by Dawes rules. When dark-skinned people assert indigenous identity, they face accusations of pretending to be indigenous to escape anti-Black racism, appropriating Native identity, not looking Indian enough. Land-back movements. The dispossession of freedmen and dark-skinned indigenous nations is often erased from land-back discourse. But returning lands to recognized tribes doesn't address freedmen whose ancestors held allotments stolen through guardian fraud, Muur and Creole nations whose territories were never legally recognized, the millions of acres in Oklahoma that were stolen through documentation violence before being stolen again through allotment fraud. The erasure continues. Modern sovereignty struggles Cherokee freedmen, 2007 present. Cherokee Nation's attempt to exclude 2,800 freedmen descendants from citizenship sparked a federal case that went on for a decade. The tribe argued that separate Dawes rolls meant freedmen were never real Cherokees. Courts have ruled they must honor the 1,866 treaty granting citizenship, but resistance continues within tribal politics. Washitaw sovereignty, 1990s present. Though courts dismissed their land claims, the Washitaw continue to assert sovereignty through maintaining traditional governance structures, issuing their own passports and identification, teaching traditional knowledge and languages, challenging the legal fiction that they don't exist. Freedmen land claims. Descendants of allottees defrauded by white guardians have filed claims seeking reparations, but face barriers, proving ownership across generations with incomplete records, navigating legal systems that favor documentary proof over oral histories, fighting statute of limitations, arguments that time bar claims for century-old thefts, challenging the legitimacy of sales that were fraudulent but technically legal. Muur and Creole recognition. Contemporary descendants seeking federal recognition face requirements for continuous community existence documented by colonial records, anthropological verification of cultural practices, genetic testing that can't distinguish African from Indigenous American ancestry, courts that view their claims through the Black Indian binary, connecting to broader patterns. The colonial reclassification system. The dispossession in Indian territory wasn't unique. It was a perfected version of systems deployed globally wherever colonizers encountered dark-skinned indigenous peoples. In the Caribbean, Taino, Kalinago, and Arawak peoples were reclassified as black or mixed race to support extinction narratives. Their descendants faced the same barriers to recognition. Demands for colonial documentation of continuous community existence, despite those very colonial systems working to erase them. In the Americas broadly, from the Garifuna to the Black Seminoles to the Freedmen, indigenous peoples of African ancestry face unique erasure because their existence challenges the racial categories that justified colonization. The purpose. These classification systems serve land theft by making Black and Indian mutually exclusive colonial powers, reduce the number of people with indigenous land claims, pit marginalized communities against each other, create documentation trails that prove certain peoples don't exist, justify ongoing occupation of territories deemed unassigned or abandoned. What justice looks like beyond recognition politics.
Addressing the dispossession of freedmen, Washitaw, Muur, and Creole nations requires more than federal recognition or citizenship in existing tribes. It requires
rejecting colonial documentation as truth. Oral histories must be valued equally with written records. Absence of colonial documentation doesn't mean absence. Dawes' roles were dispossession tools. 2. Challenging blood, quantum, and racial categories. Indigenous identity shouldn't depend on phenotype or percentages. African ancestry and indigenous identity aren't mutually exclusive. Honor matrilineal kinship. Sen, land return to dispossessed communities. Return allotments stolen by fraud. Recognize Muur and Creole territories never legally acknowledged. Restore lands labeled unassigned. 4. Reparations for documentation theft. Dawes' roles stole identity, citizenship, and land. Intergenerational losses require financial reparations that account for long-term dispossession. 5. Sovereignty without federal approval. Nations assert sovereignty regardless of federal recognition. Self-determination doesn't require colonial validation. Traditional governance predates colonial law. Conclusion. Whose land, whose story, whose future? The Oklahoma land runs are celebrated in American mythology as brave pioneers claiming opportunity in empty land. The Dawes roles are presented as benevolent government efforts to help indigenous peoples transition to civilization. The rejection of Washitaw and Muur sovereignty claims is framed as courts preventing fake Indians from exploiting the system. But when we center the voices and histories of those who were dispossessed, a different story emerges. Land runs were land theft from territories that had been cleared through documentation violence, broken treaties, and forced reclassification. The Dawes roles were weapons that fragmented resistance, erased dark-skinned indigenous peoples, and created divisions that served colonial interests 130 years later. Court rejections of sovereignty claims reveal the inadequacy of colonial legal systems, not the illegitimacy of indigenous nations whose existence challenges racial categories. The descendants of freedmen, Washitaw, Muur, and Creole peoples continue to fight for recognition, citizenship, land rights, and sovereignty. Their struggles reveal what has always been true. Colonial systems didn't just steal land through guns and treaties. They stole it through paperwork, through categories, through documentation that reclassified peoples out of existence. Understanding this history means recognizing that unassigned lands were never empty, that freedmen are indigenous peoples denied full citizenship, that Washitaw sovereignty doesn't require federal recognition, and that the Dawes roles accomplished exactly what they were designed to do: fragment, dispossess, and divide. The land was never empty, the peoples were never gone. And the fight for justice continues in every sovereignty struggle, every citizenship battle, every assertion of identity that refuses colonial categories. This article is part of the Colonial Reclassification series, examining how documentation systems weaponize racial categories to fragment indigenous resistance and facilitate land theft. For more on how these patterns echo across the African diaspora and indigenous Americas, visit Livity blog